The skeletal system provides support. It makes up the framework of the body. It helps in protecting major organs such as the brain, heart, and lungs. It provides the movement, and the bone marrow helps to make all the blood cells. It also maintains calcium homeostasis. Let's take a look at the structural hierarchy of a bone. So we'll start with bone cells, which make up bone tissue, which makes up the bone. There are several types of bone cells. The osteocyte. Osteo means bone and cyte means cell. This is a mature bone cell. Then we have osteoblast. The word blast means developing cell. Osteoblast means developing bone cell. The third type of bone cell is osteoclast. Clast means to promote breakdown. So an osteoclast is a cell that promotes bone breakdown. And this is accomplished by a process called osteolysis. Lysis, as we know, means breakdown, and osteolysis means breakdown of bone. Then we have the osteogenic cell. This is not technically a bone cell, but it is a precursor cell that generates the bone cell. The osteogenic cell gives rise to osteoblasts. Here is a section of bone tissue. Bone tissue looks like tree rings with osteocytes arranged in concentric circles. The bone tissue is organized into units of bone called osteons. The word osteon literally means bone unit. On means unit and osteo means bone. Now for the osteocytes. An osteocyte is supplied with long cellular extensions called canaliculi. These canaliculi are very important because they help the osteocyte to carry out their function, which is the maintenance of the bone matrix. The canaliculi serve as little canals that connect neighboring osteocytes with each other. The lamella is the concentric circle on which the osteocytes are arranged. The most important part of the osteon is the central canal called the osteonic canal. The osteonic canal contains the artery, vein, and nerve that supply the bone tissue. Lining each osteonic canal are the osteoblasts. And the function of osteoblasts is to make bone matrix. So what does bone matrix contain? Bone matrix has two major elements, protein and mineral. The protein part of the bone matrix provides tensile strength to the bone. In other words, it makes it more flexible. The protein that we're talking about is collagen. Collagen is a very tough protein. If collagen is deficient, it removes the flexible quality of the bone and makes it brittle. So the brittle bones can break easily. Now for the mineral. The mineral portion of the bone matrix provides support and rigidity. If the mineral component of the bone is deficient, then the bone becomes rubbery and it bends too easily, and this can lead to bone fractures. The mineral that we are talking about is called hydroxyapatite, and hydroxyapatite is made up of calcium phosphate mostly and a small amount of calcium carbonate. So the most important ion in bone is calcium, which is why the bone plays a very important role in calcium homeostasis. Here's a long bone. The long bone can be organized into two parts, the edges of the bone and the middle portion. The two edges of the bone are called the epiphyseal regions. The proximal epiphysis is closer to the attached base and the distal epiphysis is away from the attached base. The middle portion of the bone is called the diaphysis. The diaphyseal region of the bone is made up of compact bone. This makes sense because the diaphyseal region is the part of the bone that is most vulnerable to stress, so the compact bone provides a great amount of support. The bone is covered by an outer lining called the periosteum. Peri means around, osteo means bone, and eum means lining. The inner lining of the bone is called endosteum because endo means inside. The inside of the bone contains a cavity, and this cavity is called the medullary cavity. Medulla means middle. And this cavity contains yellow bone marrow, and yellow bone marrow is made up of fats. Now for the epiphyseal regions. The epiphysis of the bone is made up of spongy bone. This makes a lot of sense because the epiphyseal regions of the bone are involved in articulations. They are in the joints and they bring about movements. So it wouldn't do for this part of the bone to be compact because that would make it too heavy and movement would not be possible. The spongy bone also contains a very important element, and that is the red bone marrow. The red bone marrow is very important in making all the blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The blue structure that is shown covering each of the epiphyseal regions is the articular cartilage. The articular cartilage is made up of hyaline cartilage and it reduces friction between bones during articulation. The periosteum and the endosteum are the location for the osteoblasts and the osteogenic cells. The osteoclasts are closer to the periosteum. Now let's take a closer look at all the bone cells. We'll start with the osteogenic cell. The osteogenic cell gives rise to the osteoblast. The osteoblast is the developing bone cell. However, the function of the osteoblast is to make the bone. It does this by making the protein collagen and releasing it. Collagen is made in the rough endoplasmic reticulum of the osteoblast, which is shown here in blue. The osteoblast has large amounts of rough ER because its function is to make collagen and release it from the cell, where it becomes part of the matrix. Both the osteogenic cell and the osteoblasts are found in the periosteum and endosteum, which are the linings of the bone. The osteoblast gives rise to the osteocyte. The osteocyte is the mature bone cell. It maintains the bone matrix. The next kind of cell is the osteoclast. The osteoclast is the opposite of the osteoblast. While the osteoblast makes bone cell, osteoclast destroys it. The osteoclast is made up of many cells put together, which is why it ends up having many nuclei. The osteoclast also has many lysosomes. The lysosomes are very prominent because the function of the osteoclast is to break down bone via osteolysis. And the ruffled border that is shown here is where the bone resorption takes place. Bone resorption means breakdown of bone and release of calcium. So that is the function of the osteoclast. The osteoclast is found on the surface of the bone matrix. Let's take a look at the role of bone in maintaining calcium homeostasis. To do this, we need to imagine that the bone is like the bank and calcium is like cash in your wallet. If you have too much cash in your wallet, you would want to deposit the excess cash into the bank. If you have too little cash in your wallet, then you would want to withdraw cash from the bank. So let's use this analogy to understand what happens with calcium. If we were to think about the bloodstream as your wallet, let's start from there. Let's say you have way too much calcium in your bloodstream, then the excess calcium is deposited into the bone. We call this bone deposition, and this is brought about by increased activity of the osteoblasts. Osteoblasts bring about bone deposition. So, if you have too little calcium in blood, then you would want to withdraw the calcium, and this is brought about by osteoclast activity. And we call this bone resorption, is the bone releasing the funds or bone releasing the calcium. So it's called bone resorption and it is brought about by osteoclast activity. So to recap, osteoblasts result in bone formation by adding calcium to the bone and making more bone. Osteoclast activity, on the other hand, does the opposite. It breaks down the bone and releases the calcium into the blood. Let's take an even closer look at calcium homeostasis. When the levels of calcium in blood increase above normal, it is sensed by the thyroid gland, which releases a hormone called calcitonin. The target organ for calcitonin is the bone. When calcitonin acts on the bone, it increases osteoblast activity. And we know that osteoblast activity increases bone deposition. Bone deposition means calcium from the blood is picked up and used for bone formation. So levels of calcium in blood go down and go back to normal. And this is a negative feedback loop. Now let's take a look at the opposite situation. When the blood levels of calcium decrease and go below normal, they are sensed by the parathyroid glands, which release a hormone called parathyroid hormone, or PTH for short. PTH has two target organs, the kidneys and the bone. With the bone, it increases osteoclast activity, which increases bone resorption. Bone resorption means osteolysis occurs and calcium is released from the bone. Think released and resorption. Resorption results in release of calcium, so calcium levels in blood go up. The kidneys help to retain calcium, and that too increases calcium levels in blood. This also takes place in a negative feedback loop, resulting in increasing blood calcium levels. The continuous process of bone deposition and bone resorption is called bone remodeling. There are three reasons for bone remodeling. The first is to maintain calcium homeostasis. The bone gets remodeled as a result of that. The second is to repair any micro damage that occurs on the bone due to everyday stresses. And the third reason is for reshaping and growth of the bone. Now let's take a look at the embryological formation of bones. Depending upon the type of bone that we're dealing with, the formation is different. We could be either dealing with flat bones, such as bones of the skull, or long bones, such as the femur, humerus, tibia, ulna, fibula, etc. With the flat bones, we have intramembranous ossification. Intra meaning within the membrane, and ossification, ossify, is to make something into bone. For the long bones, the type of process involved is called endochondral ossification. Endo meaning inside and chondral meaning cartilage. This means the long bone is made from the cartilage that's inside that later becomes bone. Let's take a closer look at endochondral ossification. We are looking at the fetus, which is a few weeks old. We will start with a small cartilaginous model that will be gradually replaced by spongy bone, which will be further replaced by compact bone. So here we have a cartilaginous model that is made up of hyaline cartilage, and it is surrounded by a layer of cartilage called the perichondrium. Now, as our fetus grows, this cartilage skeleton continues to grow, and the cartilage cells or chondrocytes in the center of this model become very active, and at some point they start to die out. When they start to die out, they leave spaces in the cartilaginous model, and these spaces can be replaced by bone. Here we see the periosteum shown in red that lines the cartilaginous model. Remember that osteoblasts are in the periosteum. They can travel to the center of the bone and slowly replace the cartilage with bone. And we call this the primary ossification center. And the bone that's formed is spongy bone. Now our fetus has grown even bigger and the secondary ossification centers start to develop. In the meantime, the spongy bone starts to get slowly replaced by the medullary cavity. Here we have the bone at birth. The diaphyseal region is fully developed with compact bone and is richly supplied with blood vessels. The epiphyseal region is slowly becoming spongy bone. It is richly supplied with blood vessels so that the chondrocytes there, once they die, can be replaced by bony tissue. Here we have the bone during childhood, before puberty. So before puberty, there is the diaphyseal region is all compact bone. The epiphyseal region has a lot of cartilage. It has retained some cartilage at the edges, which becomes the articular cartilage, which reduces friction during movement. There is an epiphyseal plate that marks the junction between the diaphysis and the epiphyseal regions. We also call this the growth plate because this is where growth in length takes place during puberty. Once puberty is finished, the epiphyseal plate becomes very thin and it is just an epiphyseal line. Let's take a closer look at intramembranous ossification, which is involved in the formation of flat bones of the skull. As the name indicates, it involves several layers of fibrous connective tissue membranes that are laid down. So there are many layers of cells, connective tissue cells, that are formed at first, and some of these cells differentiate into mesenchymal cells. These specialized mesenchymal cells further differentiate to form osteoblasts. As we know, osteoblasts make the bone matrix. And once the bone matrix is made, the osteoblast can now mature into osteocytes that maintain the bone matrix. So we have osteoblasts lining the bone matrix. Here's the bone matrix, and the cells in the middle are the osteocytes with the cellular extensions. They maintain the bone matrix. As this process continues, the osteoblasts form the spongy bone at the center, and slowly this bone is remodeled into compact bone on the sides. So ultimately, the flat bones have a sandwich-like structure with compact bones on either side and a spongy bone at the center. A significant amount of bone remodeling takes place when a bone is fractured and must heal itself. So the first thing that happens when a bone breaks is that there is a considerable amount of bleeding. Within the first few hours of the fracture, a hematoma is formed. We call this the fracture hematoma. Within the next 48 hours, chondrocytes from the periosteum and the endosteum migrate to the point of injury and form a fibrocartilage. This fibrocartilage stabilizes the area of injury. We call it the soft callus. Over the next few weeks, osteoclasts break down any remaining bits of bone from the fracture, and osteoblasts multiply and they release the bone matrix. And they form the spongy bone around the blood vessels. Over time, the spongy bone is replaced by compact bone. And that is when we say that the bone is healed. But the remodeling can continue months and years afterwards in order to bring the shape of the bone back to normal.